Now, people have been recurring to this trope quite a bit, right? The Trump manufactures his own crises. In other words, he makes his own imbroglios, right? He's somebody who manufactures his own difficulties. True, and that a lot of commentators have then asked, right, have added that they shudder to think what's going to happen when Trump is confronted with a crisis which is not just public opinion, but has a military and strategic dimension, and it can be really dangerous. And how will he perform? Well, of course, he's going to perform abysmally. And I think that what we've got so far is that he has acted out his part as a weak, indecisive, dilettante president, right? Certainly minority, unpopular, weak, indecisive, not having the attention span to look into details and think about coherent policy. He has essentially devolved some commander-in-chief powers to the Pentagon, and that's just bad, because that stuff should be discussed in the full cabinet and the full National Security Council, and that's not what we're getting. We're getting Monster Mattis, okay? Mad Dog Mattis, Monster Mattis, whatever you want to call him. He's making the decisions. He's calling the shots. He'll tell you how many U.S. troops will be in Afghanistan, not Trump. Trump is just, he's interested in public relations, Twitter, polls, things like that. So we've got this situation in Syria. What is it? Syria. It's now quite serious. There's the whole region is in a furor, and a lot of it is directly traceable back to this ill-starred trip that Trump went on to the Middle East. Now, the two things that are most recent and perhaps most disturbing is the U.S. shot down a Syrian plane. Bad. That's not good. But the Syrian plane was insisting on attacking Kurdish forces that were intent on essentially completing the liberation of Raqqa, the ISIS Islamic State Daesh Caliphate capital. Right? That's Raqqa. Raqqa is about to be completely liberated, and the Kurds have done the heavy lifting. So the Turks don't like that, and I guess the Russians don't like that, because the Kurds work with the U.S. Now, it's one thing when the U.S. is supporting Al Qaeda. It's one thing when the U.S. is supporting ISIS, and they've done both. All sides have done all that, right? Now, the Russians support the Taliban in Afghanistan right now, so let's not have any morality plays, please. But the U.S. has been supporting these Kurds, right? Again, out of all the actors on the scene, they are the most positive, right? Especially if you think about the role of women in the Middle East, where the Kurds are doing a much better job than anybody else. So the Syrian plane was attacking the Kurds. The U.S. shoots down the Syrian plane. Now, Russia is having a tantrum, frankly, and I think this is now overdone. This is foolish. Putin's reputation as a world statesman is going down, down, down. This is reckless, irresponsible action, ill-considered, and it's an overreaction. Because Putin now says, okay, guess what? We're not going to do the deconflicting hotline? That's absolutely crazy. That's like saying, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, saying, oh, I don't like you anymore, I'm cutting off the hotline. It makes no sense. Or other later crises, right? Because the hotline actually came a little bit after that. But you get the idea. You don't want to cut diplomatic channels in a crisis. You want to multiply them. I've always cited Cardinal Richelieu. Read what Richelieu says. Negotiate with everybody all the time. You'll be better off all the time. So the Russians say that the deconflicting apparatus has been turned off. They're not going to exchange information about who's flying what airstrikes and where. Now we got these statements repeated from the Russian Defense Ministry that any American planes flying west of the Euphrates River, west, and you look at the map, you'll see that if you look at Syria, right, the Euphrates doesn't really go right down the middle. The Euphrates is sort of unbalanced line right. In other words, it's off to the right. So it probably leaves 2/3 of Syria to the west of the Euphrates and 1/3 to the east. So it looks like the Russians are asserting or trying to assert a sphere of influence. Now, I don't think this is bad in itself, but this is not the way to do it. You don't just go asserting a sphere of influence. You've got to negotiate your sphere of influence because maybe the other guy thinks that your sphere of influence is too big and his is too small. It's obvious that what's happening is the following. Although the American media, and especially the Republican president and the Republican Congress, forgot to tell you, ISIS is being destroyed. ISIS is collapsing. ISIS hardly exists anymore, right? ISIS is now a pale shadow of its former self. The big question now is that territory, who's going to get it? Who's going to get it? And lots of forces are getting into the act. I'm sure the Turks are getting into the act. We see the Kurds obviously regard this as a chance to get the independent country that they want. And if you're concerned about the Palestinians not having a state, and we are, you got to be concerned about the Kurds, right? They're the largest stateless nationality in the world, as far as many calculations go. But now the question is, who's going to get that territory? In other words, who's going to get eastern Syria, more or less, central and eastern Syria? So the Russians are staking a claim. The Turks, I'm sure, also. The Kurds stake a claim. The U.S. backs the Kurds. The other force that has gotten into the act is Iran, and Iran has done this by firing, half a dozen ballistic missiles from far western Iran, crossing over Iraq, right? I mean, at high altitude, because these are ballistic missiles, but still firing over, right? Some would say in Iraq, hey, wait a minute, that's our airspace. What are you doing? Perhaps the Kurds, right? The Kurds in northern Iraq are not too happy with this. I can't think that they would be. And those missiles have come down in this Deir ez-Zor area, right? So, which is eastern Syria. So the missiles traveled a total of 700 kilometers, approximately 435 miles, according to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So 6 surface-to-surface missiles, and they were targeting command centers, logistic sites, and suicide car bomb factories in the ISIS-held area of Deir ez-Zor. This is a famous, infamous place. You remember that in the time of the most serious attempted U.S. Russian-sponsored ceasefire around September of last year, when Kerry made his famous trip to Moscow with his plan for the Joint Coordination Center to be located in Jordan. We were very much in favor of that. We would still like to see it. But at that point, the U.S., for reasons we'll tell you in a minute, the U.S. bombed Deir ez-Zor, right? So in the middle of the ceasefire, the U.S. went in and bombed the Syrian army garrison of Deir ez-Zor, and that led then to blowing up the ceasefire. And probably is the case that those were unreconstructed warmongers in the Pentagon, although, there may be more to it. I'm just giving my surmise of the time.